Good morning, and thank you for joining me on the Path to Liberty. It's Wednesday, February 24th, 2021. And on this episode, I've got a bit of a rant that's kind of grown out of a recent and very brief Twitter conversation with my buddy Alan Mosley, who hosts this really cool late night show called It's Too Late with Alan Mosley. It's some liberty, some current events, some other stuff. Anyways, we've had this conversation many times about opposition from friendly fire. And a quick aside, actually, especially for those of you watching the live stream, I've done some moderate upgrades to my setup here. I've been having some problems with some audio that I think is not up to snuff, up to par, some plosives, some bad sound. So I've dug out of the closet this old boom arm, which you can see here, plus this double layer screen to help stop that popping sound. And I really still need to replace this shock mount because it's like old and needs to be replaced. Anyways, if you have problems with the audio, please do let me know, whether it's here live or in the archives, and maybe I can make some adjustments or I can figure it out on the next episode. But anyways, if you're like me, you've been attacked by friendly fire, oftentimes from libertarians calling us a statist. This has happened so many times to me over the years that I can't even count it. And we're called a statist in these situations where we're actually posting or supporting things that expand liberty. It's just that we're bad because what we support doesn't go far enough. So I've got some examples of how this actually plays out, primarily on legalization efforts. I've got some great quotes from leading founders talking about a different strategy than they take, the strategy that we use here. People like John Dickinson, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, maybe others. I'm going to briefly talk about one of the greatest abolitionists in American history. And then I'm also going to point out that this small subset of libertarians who attack anything and everything as not being good enough are actually rejecting the views of a guy we can call Mr. Libertarian himself. But first of all, before getting to that, my name is Michael Bolden. We broadcast live every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 9:30 a.m. Pacific time from here in my home office and studio in downtown Los Angeles for the 10th Amendment Center. Our show homepage is 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. All spelled out, 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. That's where you're going to find everything you need to follow this program. All the archives for over 2.5 years. Individual episodes. I will link to stuff, not as much on this episode as I have in others when I'm talking about a history lesson, but I link to original source documents or articles that I mention so you can read and learn more on your own time. I'm just scratching the surface in almost every one of these episodes. We've also got all the different platforms run, especially those of you who watch us on the mainstream ones like YouTube, Facebook, Twitch, Twitter, and elsewhere. We may suddenly be gone, surprise, surprise, from one of those platforms. And I want you to know where else you can find us, like Odyssey.com, which is decentralized and censorship resistant. That's the web-facing version of Library.tv. We're also on Gab TV. Sometimes, depending on the file size, we're also on MeWe and Minds and elsewhere. We're on Brighteon, BitChute, BitTube, and plus the audio versions podcast over at Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Path to Liberty. And a quick hello to everyone out in the live chat before I get to this, and we allow people a few more minutes to get notifications to join us in the live stream. There's Blue North Wind. Good to see you, Rachel. Thank you so much for your support. Good to see you, Bob Landry. Funky Euphemism. President Merkin Muffley. Good to see you as well, MRGF. Tim Martin, Tyler B., William Wright, Melody Skaman. I hope everyone's really gotten through all the difficulties with electricity and the cold and all that stuff. That has been just awful. Clay Kent is out there as well. Patricia Dance, Erwin Haverneck. There's Alan Mosley who says, it must just be me. He's never been attacked. Of course not. Brandy Lee Hope, RT Allen Projects, and everyone else. I apologize if I missed anybody. I will try to look back a little bit later in the episode and see if I can answer some of your questions or comments, but I do read through them later on and I get tons of ideas for future episodes. I appreciate the feedback. I appreciate the comments, and it helps trigger the algorithm of the platform and tells that algorithm to show the program to more people. Anyways, let's get right to this. And I want to start this out by setting the stage with a guy named John Dickinson. This is, you've probably heard me reference him quite a bit lately. If you've been listening to the show on a regular basis, we know him as the penman of the Revolution. He wrote a series of letters called Letters from a Farmer in Pennsylvania. They were basically 12 op-eds, and they were the most widely read documents on American liberty until Thomas Paine's Common Sense was published in 1776. People knew who this guy was. And in his first letter, he's talking about something called the New York Restraining Act. And here, let me just pull it up here. See if I can get this working. He says, if the Parliament may lawfully deprive New York of any of her rights. They were restraining the Parliament of New York because New York was getting a little out of hand. So Parliament just says, you can't even do anything locally. We're taking over everything here. If Parliament may lawfully deprive New York of any of her rights, it may deprive any or all the other colonies of their rights. And nothing can possibly so much encourage such attempts as a mutual inattention to the interests of each other. He goes on, he says, he certainly is not a wise man who folds his arms and reposes himself at home, viewing with unconcern the flames that have invaded his neighbor's house, without using any endeavors to extinguish them. That doesn't relate directly, but I wanted to kind of set the stage for what he was talking about in this first letter in 1767 in response to the hated Townshend Acts. He signed off that first letter. He signed off every single one of them with a different Latin phrase. And in this one, he signed off with the phrase Concordia res parve crescunt, which means small things grow great by concord. He was basically saying, you know, you may not be able to stop what's happening in New York, here in Pennsylvania, or somewhere else in one of the other colonies, but you can at least lobby and register your opposition. He says, just this tiny step, you may think it means nothing, but it brings awareness and it can start the foundation for doing more. So small things grow great by concord. For those of you who are annual members of the 10th Amendment Center and you have one of these cool membership cards, if I can get it to focus, we actually have that phrase in script along the side here, Concordia res parve crescunt, because we believe in the strategy of the founders and old revolutionaries. I actually covered that phrase in an episode of its own 2 years ago now almost, Winning for Liberty, the story of small things grow great by concord. I will link to that in the show notes so you can check it out if you haven't or want another listen at your own time. That was back from June of 2019. So just, I guess yesterday, that brings me to my rant and this short conversation I was having with Alan Mosley. I posted a tweet on my Twitter. You should follow me at Michael Bolden if you haven't. Years ago, I'd hear a lot of libertarians opposing legalizing marijuana is what I tweeted. And you would be surprised because a lot of times the attack on libertarians is, you know, they don't care about anything. They're just nihilists who want to smoke weed. And everyone thinks that libertarians are always in favor of legalization. But we actually saw over the years, and I've been doing this with 10th Amendment Center since 2006, we've seen many, many times libertarians actually oppose, it's a small subset of them, opposing efforts to legalize marijuana. And I put, seriously, this really happened. You might be surprised. A main complaint was that legalization didn't also include expungement and end prosecution and was considered a gift to the state. So I would keep telling them that you just got to take one step at a time. Small things grow great by concord. You see, there's a certain strain of thought, and it's mostly in libertarian circles. But you also find it in other areas that I'll mention briefly later on the left and the right, that every step forward, every single step forward on an issue that's important to that person is actually bad. They actually oppose anything that is a small step forward. Sometimes it's just trash talking. Sometimes they're just keyboard warriors and they're just out there being contrarian for the sake of being contrarian. But sometimes there's actually organized opposition and lobbying against things like this. They oppose it unless it's all steps forward at one time. Everything else is not good enough and should actually be rejected. Now, even though this happens, even though these same people rarely, and I never really see, I'm just saying rarely because I haven't seen it, maybe at some point or another, someone will give me an example, but these same people rarely, if ever, and I'm going to just say never, give examples of how their view actually works in the real world. That is, get everything done in one single step. Go from point A to point Z and skip out all the steps in the middle. So how do we get from where we are today to what their vision is in one fell swoop. It kind of rejects that old Chinese proverb. We know the journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step. The weed example, I think, is a really good one when I'm talking about this, and hopefully it's going to make sense as I keep going. So first we started out, we know Proposition 215 passed here in California back in 1996. I was not running a 10th Amendment Center at the time. I was still a statist pig in my own estimation, some kind of a socialist, commie, Marxist kind of guy. But over the years, we got involved and we started supporting these efforts because they were rejecting a federal program that should not exist. So as long as you keep the status quo, basically what you're saying is that the federal status quo, the unconstitutional status quo, should continue. And we're saying, no, 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 no. Legalize what the federal government prohibits, whether it's weed or guns or something else. And they don't have the manpower to enforce this, and we can chip away at the monster state, the largest government in the history of the world. So as we started doing that, we learned that there was opposition from friendly places. I was very surprised to see this. In general, the opposition was saying, look, you can't just do medical. If you're only going to say people can use it for medicine, this is bad. I oppose it because everyone should have access. So, you know, it's a little bit of a whack-a-mole, because we would also hear things like, if you have to register or get a card, then we want to oppose it because this is giving the state more power, rejecting the idea that some people really need the substance, need the plant for medical reasons, and other people just aren't in line with your view of things yet. And maybe they'll learn that you don't need the state registration cards over time. I guess that's kind of a side note. Then once medical has gained real heavy attraction, we started seeing years later, and it's taken quite a long time, moving towards recreational legalization, many, many years. Then the opposition shifted from, well, you can't just do medical and you got to have recreational. Once you give them recreational, then you start hearing, oftentimes from the same quarters, the same people, sometimes the exact same people 5 years later, you'll hear things like, well, we can't do this because, like I mentioned in that tweet, if you legalize, but you don't address the fact that people are being prosecuted or have been in prison, you don't deal with that right now, it's not good enough. Again, we got to oppose this because it's not good enough. And so then we started seeing, after a couple more years, efforts on legalization to include what's called expungement. And the reason I tweeted this particular thing yesterday was because there was an article at Marijuana Moment talking about the New Jersey marijuana legalization that was just signed into law by the governor. And even though the law isn't in effect, the Attorney General has just issued an order throughout the state to stop prosecution. So if you're in the middle of a marijuana prosecution for something that's going to be implemented in the next few months, stop prosecuting. 5, 7 years ago, that certainly did not happen. In fact, they would continue prosecuting as long as they could. And in fact, they probably would have still done that in New Jersey had this New Jersey AG not ordered them to stop. So we would hear from people, look, they're still prosecuting. There are people in prison for this. There are people who have felony records. They've got records that are destroying their lives. So until you can get that all done at the same time, we're going to oppose this recreational legalization thing. So I said, look, just wait. We've got to, not that you don't agree with them on that point, not on the opposing part, but that this stuff is bad, that people shouldn't be in prison for owning a plant or consuming a plant or owning a firearm or, just for what you own rather than what you do with it. I agree with that, certainly. I want to see full abolition, but thinking you're going to get an entire society to move from full prohibition to full abolition in one fell swoop is absurd. So we would get a lot of opposition on that as well. So then now we've seen recreational efforts start to include things like expungement, saying like, if you've been convicted of something that is now legal, we're going to remove that from your criminal record. That can affect, having a criminal record, just an aside, really can affect someone's ability to get a job, sometimes to get a firearm, because they're having to fill out unconstitutional license and paperwork stuff from the feds, these background checks. So the feds are kind of using this stuff against us anyways. So it's hard to get a firearm, it's hard to get a job, it can be hard to get a lease on an apartment. I know people who have to really, really work hard because they've got some kind of conviction from years ago and they can't get past it. So the punishment doesn't end at a certain time, it continues in the future. So it is good to have expungement. So we start seeing in places like Illinois, once they legalize, they've decided to say, you know what, people who have been convicted of stuff that we've made legal now, we don't want them to have felony records. Sometimes it's an automatic expungement. Sometimes they give people the opportunity to apply to get it removed. So then the new opposition, we're playing whack-a-mole here. It started with medical, it wasn't broad enough. Once it's broad enough, then it doesn't include expungement. Once you include expungement, now they're saying, well, you got to oppose it because it includes a regulatory structure. It includes taxes. And all that stuff is garbage. We don't want government to get more money. It's the largest government in the history of the world in Washington, D.C. We don't want them to have more money, but we don't want them to have more money and at the same time continue to put people in prison for nonviolent offenses. Now, mind you, a lot of the people saying this type of thing are also doing this over an internet connection, which has federal taxation, federal regulation. They're doing it on a cell phone, which they paid taxation. There's probably federal taxes for your phone plan. Or they're driving to a protest against something, paying for gas with all kinds of federal gas taxes. So at the same time that they're rejecting one thing for this, they're using the system that's in there and expressing their freedom as much as they can, but not opposing the taxation and regulation in these other areas. We're not hearing anybody saying, you know, alcohol should be illegal until you remove the entire regulatory structure, or until you remove the idea of people needing a permit to buy and sell it, or to sell at very least, or to produce it, or you can't use certain production methods, or you can't transport it. No one's saying that, or get rid of the gas tax. We got to make gasoline illegal until the taxes are gone. We don't want people to go to prison or have a giant police state and surveillance state that supports it just to prevent taxes. Now, the taxes are bad. I'm on board with the message that taxation is theft, but it certainly is a less bad scenario than people having their lives and liberty totally stolen from them and locked up in a cage. So in practice, this small subset of libertarians who oppose on these grounds and do this kind of whack-a-mole, until you get rid of everything, they end up being on the side of government. They end up being on the side of the police state because they're saying we're not going to support any change, and they sometimes even lobby against that. And I'd make the case that they're actually arguing against the position of a guy that we can call Mr. Libertarian. His name is Murray Rothbard. And here, from a great article, a great post from the 1960s that's over at Mises.org, he put it this way. He says, for the libertarian, the main task of the present epoch is to cast off his needless and debilitating pessimism, to set his sights on long-run victory, and to set about the road to its attainment. Now, Rothbard didn't specifically say we're going to take small steps here, but you can pretty much read into this. If you think it's going to require a long-run victory, he's not. In fact, the first part of that article, he's actually complaining about people having a short-term vision. He said that's the view of conservatives. Conservatives think everything's collapsing around them, and he's saying they only focus on the next vote, and that's it. They're not thinking long-term. But libertarians fall into this trap as well. They're pessimistic. And I understand when you can see that everything is enforced at the barrel of a gun, that everything seems bad, and it certainly is bad. But the less people that are getting prosecuted for something, I would say, is a net win for liberty. And that's basically, I think, what Rothbard is getting to here as well. He's like, you know, you got to get rid of this pessimism. You have to have this ultimate principle that you want to get to, but you have to set about the road to its attainment. And you don't get that in one fell swoop. And in fact, he said this again in the 60s. He says, libertarians must come to realize that parroting ultimate principles is not enough for coping with the real world. Again, libertarians must come to realize that parroting ultimate principles is not enough for coping with the real world. Now, that doesn't mean that we don't want to parrot ultimate principles. In fact, having ultimate principles is very important as we're taking the small steps. And this is in line with what Thomas Jefferson had to say. I've cited this many times on this show, so maybe you've heard it. If not, I think it's a good refresher. the very day after the governor of Kentucky signed the Kentucky Resolutions of 1798. We think of Thomas Jefferson as formalizing the principles of nullification against the Alien and Sedition Acts in those resolutions that he drafted in secret. At least at that point, it was still secret. So the day after they passed, he is excited. He's very happy that he's taking a small step in that this Kentucky legislature passed a non-binding resolution affirming the principles of nullification against an unconstitutional federal act. It didn't get rid of that federal act in one fell swoop. It was one small step. Small things grow great by concord. We know Jefferson had great respect for Dickinson, worked with him, sometimes opposed him, sometimes supported, but certainly had great respect for Dickinson, and I think he well understood that principle as well. And here's how he put it to James Madison, who then took the lead, took the torch, and then worked to get introduced and passed similar resolutions in Virginia that year, the Virginia Resolutions of 1798. Here's how Jefferson put it. He says, I think we should distinctly, well, I'll back up. I enclose you a copy of the draft of the Kentucky Resolves. I think we should distinctly affirm all the important principles they contain so as to hold to that ground in the future and leave the matter in such a train as that we may not be committed absolutely to push the matter to extremities and yet may be free to push as far as events will render prudent. Let me just break that down. I think it should be pretty clear. He's basically saying we have to parrot ultimate principles. We certainly have to hold to our ultimate principles. And he was saying the ultimate principles are in those resolutions. We need to hold to them. We need to get the word out about what they are. But strategically, we can't push, we can't, go too far. We can't take things where it goes to an extreme where we don't get anything done. We may be free to push as far as events will render prudent. Now, if you think about it, if you actually think about this a little bit further, we can absolutely see this happening. This Jeffersonian strategy, this Dickinsonian strategy is actually happening and it's working. The weed example is incredible. You start out with a single state in California in 1996 where 3 different presidents, one current one at the time and 2 prior ones, came to the state to lobby against the people voting for Prop 215 in the run-up to that vote. They lobbied against it, said you can't do this. If you do it, you're going to lose. If you do it, we're going to enforce anyways. If you do it, you're going to court and you're going to lose. So don't waste your time and money. And they did it anyways. They went it alone. It was limited when it first started. There were a lot of raids, federal and state raids, especially a combination of the 2 joint task forces, for example. There were a lot of raids. A lot of people lost their liberty in the process. I know one of the first people from West Hollywood that was running a dispensary went to prison and actually died in prison for running a dispensary that was legal under state law. Anyways, it started with one small step and then another and then another. And I've gone through this story in other episodes, but basically by the time the Supreme Court actually heard the case, Gonzalez versus Raich, there were 10 states that had grown and expanded into a medical marijuana, medical only. And you'd think that if the Supreme Court said, this is federal law is supreme and we don't care what your state law is, because that's basically what Gonzalez versus Raich said in 2005, you'd think that they would all repeal it afterwards. And again, it was 10 states at that time. Shortly after, it was 14, and today we're at 36 with 15 at fully recreational. So we see this Jeffersonian strategy playing out step by step by step, expanding. You start with medical, you go to recreational, you include expungement, and maybe if libertarians focus more time on expanding their arguments against the taxation and regulatory scheme rather than opposing the efforts and showing how maybe we can do things differently or working in smaller areas, maybe they can get through that as well. We haven't seen it happen on cigarettes or beer, any other of these other types of products that have taxes on it, but that certainly has to be a long-term goal. And if we're talking about parroting ultimate principles, maybe that should be part of the strategy. Like, this is a good step forward. In fact, we've changed a lot of our messaging on our website at 10thamendmentcenter.com when we report on nullification efforts. I think we did a bad job years ago explaining what was happening on the ground. Like, sometimes it's a foundational first step, but there's a long way to go, and we weren't really explaining that well years ago. Now, we can also see this step-by-step approach working really well from our enemies, the supporters of the monster state. We've seen this forever. We know that power always seeks to expand, but it doesn't go from point A to point Z in one fell swoop. A great example of this, of course, is the income tax. We know that it started out as a small, temporary, wartime measure that was only going to be a tiny few percentage points on the richest of the rich, and then that was it. But it has grown and grown and grown. We know that the Patriot Act was only going to be used for the terrorists, and it probably wasn't intended to be that way right off the bat, but it has been expanded. The surveillance state has grown and grown and grown out of that as well. So we know from our own example in modern times on the weed situation that this thing actually works. This strategy works. John Dickinson's strategy worked at the time of the Revolution. Small things did grow great by concord, and they eventually seceded from the empire. And I know I'm picking on libertarians. Oh, I wanted to point out that I did an episode about the history of the 16th Amendment and the federal income tax that I think goes over how government expands from one small step. They know how it works. Why don't we follow the strategy that has been so effective and do the same thing on our side? I don't understand why some people reject that. Maybe they're just keyboard warriors. Maybe they're addicted to pessimism. Maybe they're feds. Who knows? But we see this happen all the time. I will link to this 16th Amendment ratified episode because I think it's really interesting history, so you can check it out at your own time. And I know I'm picking on libertarians. I'm picking on people who are oftentimes friends that I'll talk to, I would hang out with. But it's not just them. We see this happen from abolitionists across the political spectrum. And I consider myself an abolitionist on so many different things. But I know that you don't get from prohibition to abolition, whatever it may be, on a plant or a gun or anything in between, again, in one fell swoop. Surveillance abolitionists on the left. There's an organization here in Los Angeles who I respect a great deal. They do a lot of really, really good grassroots organizing and lobbying against the surveillance state. But if it's not a total abolition of something, they will actually lobby against it. And they're correct in saying that if you leave them a tiny inch, they will always try to use that to expand their power over time. But we know that government will always do this anyways. So even if you ban it completely, government will still try to come in and expand that power in the future. So every step towards restricting it allows us an opportunity to show the general public that the world doesn't come to an end if they do not have warrantless surveillance by license plate readers. So, for example, this organization, if you just include a requirement that if they're going to use a surveillance technology, but they have to follow the standard of a warrant based on probable cause, they'll say, no, we can't allow them to have the tools at all. We have to ban it. And so then they lobby against it. So they end up, in many ways, supporting the police state they so aggressively oppose. And we see the same type of thing on the right-wing end of the spectrum as well, on dealing with federal gun control. When we support an effort to nullify federal gun control, it's always a foundational step forward. You can't get it all done in one day. Plus, arrest all the feds who are trying to violate our rights, and anyone can go anywhere and buy anything and sell anything and make anything all in one day. This is an unrealistic expectation that I don't think ever plays out in history. And that makes me think of one of the greatest abolitionists in history, a guy we should know his history. His name is William Lloyd Garrison. And here from an article by Mike Meharry, he says he's steadfastly struck by his call for absolute and immediate emancipation of all slaves. He was a total abolitionist. Mike goes on, he says he believed slavery should end immediately, and he constantly said so. He wasn't concerned about winning a popularity contest or convincing people he was properly mainstream. I'm totally on board with that. If you're mainstream, especially when you live under the monster state we live under today, if you have a mainstream view, it's probably pretty bad, at least at this point. So we can use that as kind of a benchmark. If you're accepted, your views, your approach, your strategy is accepted by the general population, it probably sucks. Now, that might change in the future if there ever is just a small government or a limited one or an ANCAP society in some area. but not today. So he wasn't trying to be mainstream. This is Garrison. He unapologetically wore a badge of radicalism. He unwaveringly pursued the ideal. And Mike goes on, but Garrison wasn't just running around like a proverbial bull in a china shop. He had pragmatic reasons for maintaining his hardcore stance. He recognized that by pushing for the ultimate goal, he was more likely to reach it. And that's what Jefferson was getting at in 1798. You can't water down your principles to get a small step forward, because then you end up at best with the watered down principle. And in fact, this is what Garrison recognized as well. He said this: urge immediate abolition as earnestly as we may. It will, alas, be gradual abolition in the end. We have never said that slavery would be overthrown by a single blow. That it ought to be, we shall always contend. Again, this is the Jeffersonian approach some years later. You argue for the ultimate principle, you make the case for it, but you realize that moves the bar, and every step towards that is a positive step in the long run. Jefferson put this again in another letter. This is to Reverend Charles Clay in January of 1790. He again put it this way: the ground of liberty is to be gained by inches, that we must be contented to secure what we can get from time to time, and eternally press forward for what is yet to get. It takes time, Jefferson said, to persuade men to do even what is for their own good. People have to learn how things play out. When we're children, we learn stuff. When we're adults, we learn stuff. When we exercise, I lost weight. I was 257 pounds some years ago. I didn't go from 257 and losing 50, 60 pounds in a week. It took years and years of consistent effort, dedication. I've got a long ways to go still, but it's definitely a positive path, but it is a long-term vision that wins for liberty. Short-term goals mean you get disillusioned, you get frustrated, and then you give up. And in the end, the state ends up winning. And that's what basically this type of approach, this is how John Adams, and I learned how to pronounce this name properly just recently, in a letter to Hezekiah. I used to say Hezekiah. It's Hezekiah Niles in February of 1818. This is how John Adams described the American Revolution. He says, but what do we mean by the American Revolution? Do we mean the American War? The Revolution was effected before the war commenced. The Revolution was in the minds and hearts of the people, a change in their religious sentiments, of their duties and obligations. And a little further down, he says, this radical change in the principles, opinions, sentiments, and affection of the people was the real American Revolution. So what we're talking about here is a revolution in thought, in approach, in ideals, in principles, and that takes time. It takes time to convince people to do what's even good for them. And the best way to show people what's good for them is to prove it to them by practice, in example. Just yelling at someone that they're some kind of a statist pig because they may support a taxation and regulation scheme that you're probably going out to some microbrewery and paying for as well, and not being opposed to that for buying some beer. That doesn't get them to start saying, you know what, I better call my state legislator and tell them, you know, we don't want any taxation, we don't want any regulation on this, we want it to be a free market. Because suddenly this guy on the internet yelled at me and told me that I was a statist pig and I was supporting my own oppression and I'm supporting a slave document, or whatever it may be, the types of phrases that we hear. That doesn't convince them. But what does convince people is, first of all, for decades, we've heard that prohibition saves lives, whether it's gun prohibition or plant prohibition or anything in between. And really, this is nonsense. People are going to be dying in the streets if people are allowed to do stuff. And so over time, when people are allowed to do things, make their own choices, even if they have to pay taxes or there's a regulatory scheme or a bunch of bureaucrats overseeing something, when a bunch of people don't die, then other people get involved and opposition falls away. And we've seen this happen on the weed example. That's why we're at 36 states and counting, and 15 states on recreational. I think the gun rights people need to follow that same approach. I wish I had a link to it to pull up. I'll try to remember to put it in the show notes at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. But Mike Meharry wrote a great article recently that says, Dear gun people, please follow the lead of the weed people. So we have to think about this strategy. If we follow the advice of people like Rothbard, of Garrison, of Jefferson, of Dickinson, I think we're going to be able to expand liberty in the long run. Well, I hope you guys found this interesting. Again, like I said, it was kind of a rant. I figured it was good to do this type of an episode while I'm testing out the new, well, it's actually old. It's like 10, 12-year-old studio gear that I've put back in. I dug out of the closet, but I thought it would be good to do that in case I screwed everything up. Alan says, you might be a statist pig who talks about my constitution, but you're my statist pig. Anyways, Erwin Havernick says, Nebraska will be the last state to legalize weed. As a quick aside, Nebraska, there's a committee hearing today on a bill, LB 188, which would establish the foundation to nullify federal gun control. It's got a bunch of co-sponsors, and we're going to see what happens. I'm not sure the exact process there. I think it has to first have a hearing and then have a vote. So maybe they'll learn that if you end prohibition on one thing, you can end prohibition on another. Now, maybe you're not going to get that done. Maybe it won't happen in our lifetime. But we want to get government out of our way as much as possible. The Chicken Man's talking about magazine capacity. There was a bill in Colorado to increase capacity to 15 rounds from 10. But some advocates didn't like any limit and discouraged legislators from voting for it, so it failed. Yeah, this is the exact type of thing that I'm talking about. So instead of having less people in jail for doing something or less restrictions on our choice, instead of having an example where 15 rounds doesn't mean everyone's dead in the streets, then maybe we can remove that limit in the future. Instead, we're still at the status quo, I guess we can call it. We're supporting the police state. We're supporting the prohibition mentality because we're going for this all or nothing approach, even though no one ever shows me an example of getting all or nothing, some government program removed in one step. Clay Kent says, as a libertarian, Michael, I am not offended. That's cool. I have a lot of friends. Most of my friends, at least in this work, are certainly libertarians. Locally, they're mostly statist progressive pigs, but that's cool. I love who I love, no matter what their views are, whether I think they're wrong. They all think I'm nuts as well anyways. White Space Marine says background checks are racist. Yeah, that's actually an interesting point. And a lot of the gun control has been racist in the past. We know that the NRA, for example, supported a very racist gun control effort here in California back in the 60s. Erwin says, great presentation. I hope you guys appreciated this type of thing. I just want to kind of get this off my chest. I know I've touched on it in some episodes, but it's been quite a while talking about strategy, talking about opposition from keyboard warriors or from people who have unrealistic expectations of how we're going to fight against the largest government in the history of the world. We're not going to go from point A to point Z by skipping over all the letters in between. Maybe we'll be able to skip D, E, and F, but we're never going to get to total liberty in one step. I hope you support the show. I hope you like what we're doing. If you do, you can smash the like button, leave a review on Apple Podcasts, leave some comments. All that stuff triggers the algorithm of the platforms, and it tells those platforms to show the program to more people. And of course, if you want to put your financial faith behind our work, do not feel any obligation to do so. But it's over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. For as little as $2 a month, we make it go a long, long way in support of the Constitution and liberty. Again, I really appreciate you spending some time with me today. I appreciate you listening to me ramble on about this topic that I think is incredibly important, that I hope we can move forward from. And I'll see you next time here on the path to liberty.